He had spent $4 million trying to make his son walk again, but it was the woman who cleaned their floors for minimum wage who would teach them both how to truly stand. Welcome to our channel, beautiful souls. Before we dive into today's powerful story, I want you to know that every tale we share here is meant to touch hearts and remind us of life's unexpected miracles. If you're new here, please introduce yourself in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and let's pray together for everyone in our community. Your presence makes this family complete. Now settle in for a story that will change how you see love, healing, and hope forever. The Weight of Gold. The marble floors of the Gyllenhaal estate stretched endlessly, polished to mirror perfection, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Jake Gyllenhaal stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his reflection ghost-like against the morning light. At 42, he possessed everything money could buy: the 20,000-square-foot mansion, the fleet of luxury cars, the investment portfolio that generated millions while he slept. Yet his hands trembled as he held the latest medical report. Permanent paralysis. No further surgical options recommended. The words blurred as his vision clouded. $4 million, 16 specialists across 3 continents, the world's most advanced stem cell treatments, experimental procedures, revolutionary therapies that existed only in the finest medical journals. All of it worthless. His phone buzzed. Another doctor returning his call, another expert ready to take his money and deliver the same crushing verdict. Jake silenced it without looking. The silence that followed felt heavier than the weight of his failures. Upstairs, 10-year-old Tommy lay in his custom hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitored everything except what mattered most: his spirit. The boy who once ran through these halls, who climbed every tree on their 50-acre property, who dreamed of playing professional soccer, now stared at ceiling murals Jake had commissioned to make the room feel less like a medical ward. "Dad," Tommy's voice drifted down the hallway as Jake climbed the stairs. "Did Dr. Hoffman call back?" Jake paused outside his son's room, composing his face into a mask of optimism he no longer felt. "Not yet, buddy, but we're going to keep trying, okay?" Tommy nodded, but Jake caught the flicker of resignation in his son's eyes. Too old, too knowing for a 10-year-old. The accident had taken more than his legs. It had stolen his childhood wonder, replacing it with adult understanding of limitation and loss. 2,000 miles away, Joyce Meyer folded her last load of laundry in a studio apartment that could fit inside Jake's walk-in closet. At 35, her hands bore the calluses of 20 years spent cleaning other people's homes, raising other people's children while her own dreams gathered dust. The eviction notice had arrived yesterday. Third notice, final warning. Joyce knelt by her bed, fingers tracing the wooden cross her grandmother had given her before she died. "Diosito, I need a miracle, just one door to open." Her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize with a Manhattan area code. "Ms. Meyer, this is Jennifer, Mr. Gyllenhaal's assistant. We received your application through the domestic staffing agency. Would you be available for a live-in position starting immediately?" Joyce's heart hammered. Live-in meant steady pay, meals, shelter. It meant survival. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'm available." "Excellent. I must inform you this position requires special sensitivity. Mr. Gyllenhaal's son has medical needs. You'd be responsible for light housekeeping, meal preparation, and assistance with Tommy when needed. The salary is generous, but the family values privacy and discretion above all else." After the call ended, Joyce sat in the gathering dusk of her tiny apartment. She had no formal medical training, no experience with disabled children, no reason to believe she belonged in the world of Manhattan millionaires. But something in her chest fluttered. Not hope exactly, but its distant cousin, possibility. That night, Jake stood in Tommy's doorway watching his son sleep. His legs lay motionless beneath the covers, thin from months of atrophy despite the endless physical therapy sessions that cost more per hour than most people earn in a week. Tomorrow, the new housekeeper would arrive. Jake barely remembered hiring her. Just another name on a list his assistant had provided. Another person who would see Tommy's condition, offer empty sympathy, and eventually leave like all the others. The parade of nurses, therapists, and specialists had become a blur of professional competence and emotional distance. He pulled Tommy's blanket higher, kissing his forehead gently. "I love you, son. I'm going to fix this. I promise." But as Jake walked to his own empty bedroom, the promise felt like another lie he told himself. He had promised Tommy the same thing every day for 8 months, and every day those motionless legs mocked his failure. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility, unaware that tomorrow a woman carrying nothing but faith and a worn suitcase would walk through their doors and change everything they thought they knew about healing, hope, and the medicine found in human touch. Joyce packed her few belongings, her grandmother's cross safely tucked in her pocket. She didn't know she was about to meet a man whose heart was as paralyzed as her son's legs, or that her gentle hands would unlock more than anyone imagined possible. The morning sun would rise on 2 broken souls, each carrying wounds money couldn't heal, about to discover that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as ordinary people with extraordinary love. What do you think about this opening? Can you feel the contrast between Jake's wealth and emptiness versus Joyce's poverty and hope? Drop a comment below and let me know what emotions this first act stirred in you. I love hearing your thoughts as we journey through this story together. When worlds collide. The black town car pulled through the wrought iron gates at precisely 8 a.m., carrying Joyce Meyer into a world that seemed lifted from a magazine spread. She pressed her face to the window, watching manicured gardens blur past, roses that probably cost more than her monthly rent, fountains that sparkled like diamonds in the morning light. "First time working for the 1%?" the driver asked, catching her wide-eyed expression in the rearview mirror. "Is it that obvious?" Joyce smoothed her best dress, a simple navy blue she'd worn to church for the past 3 years. "They're good people," he said softly. "The kid, he's been through hell. And his father?" He shook his head. "Well, you'll see." The mansion loomed before them, all glass and stone and impossible angles that seemed to defy gravity. Joyce clutched her grandmother's cross through the fabric of her pocket, whispering a quick prayer as the car stopped beneath a portico that could have sheltered her entire apartment building. Jennifer, the assistant, greeted her with professional warmth and a clipboard thick with NDAs and household protocols. The tour was a blur of marble and crystal, rooms with names like the Morning Parlor and the Winter Study. Joyce nodded at appropriate intervals, but her attention kept drifting upward, toward the sounds of life on the second floor. "Mr. Gyllenhaal is in meetings most days," Jennifer explained, as they climbed a staircase wide enough for a small parade. "He's intensely focused on Tommy's care. Sometimes that focus can seem—" She paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Overwhelming. The previous housekeepers found his dedication challenging." She paused outside a door decorated with soccer ball stickers and a hand-painted sign reading, "Tommy's Room, Future World Cup Champion." Joyce's heart clenched at the optimism frozen in time. "He's having his morning physical therapy session," Jennifer whispered. "We can introduce you later." But then Joyce heard it, a child's voice, tight with frustration and pain. "I can't do it. I can't feel anything. Why do we keep pretending?" A man's voice followed, strained and desperate. "Come on, Tommy. Just try. The doctor said if we keep working—" "The doctor said a lot of things, and nothing changes." Something cracked in Joyce's chest. Before Jennifer could stop her, she was knocking gently on the door. "Mr. Gyllenhaal, I'm Maria, the new housekeeper. May I come in?" Silence, Then footsteps, and the door opened to reveal a man who looked like he hadn't slept in months. Jake Gyllenhaal's famous features were drawn with exhaustion, his hair disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled from what was clearly another sleepless night. But his eyes were what stopped Joyce cold, gray-blue and drowning in a desperation so raw it was almost indecent to witness. "This isn't a good time," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad, who is it?" The boy's voice carried curiosity now instead of frustration. Joyce stepped around Jake gently, her eyes finding Tommy immediately. He sat on the edge of a therapy table, his legs dangling uselessly in expensive orthopedic braces. But what struck her wasn't his disability, it was the defeat in his young shoulders, the way he held himself like an apology. "Hola, Tommy," she said softly, approaching slowly as she would a frightened animal. "I'm Maria. I'm going to be helping around the house." "Are you a nurse?" Tommy asked, wariness creeping into his voice. "No, mi amor. I just clean things, cook sometimes. Nothing medical." She glanced at the complex therapy equipment surrounding them, the charts tracking microscopic improvements, the shelf of abandoned toys gathering dust. "But I know about other things, too." Jake stepped forward, protective instinct flaring. "Miss Meyer, Tommy's therapy is very specific. Dr. Harrison designed this regimen." "Papa?" Joyce said gently, the Spanish word slipping out unbidden. Then, catching herself, "I'm sorry, Mr. Gyllenhaal, I meant no disrespect." Something in her tone, the way she had called him father without thinking, the gentle authority in her voice, made Jake pause. Tommy was staring at her with an expression Jake hadn't seen in months: curiosity. "You have an accent," Tommy observed. "Where are you from?" "Mexico, a little town called Esperanza. It means hope." Joyce moved closer, her eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "My grandmother used to say that hope is like a muscle. It gets stronger when you exercise it, but in different ways than people think." "How?" Tommy asked, leaning forward despite himself. Jake watched, transfixed, as his son engaged with a stranger for the first time since the accident. Every doctor, every therapist, every specialist had approached Tommy with clinical detachment or false cheer. But Joyce spoke to him like he was simply a boy, not a collection of symptoms to be managed. "Well," Joyce said, settling into a chair beside the therapy table, "my grandmother couldn't walk the last 5 years of her life. Diabetes took her legs. But you know what? She taught me to dance." Tommy's eyebrow shot up. "How?" "She sat in her wheelchair and showed me the movements with her arms, her shoulders, her smile. She said dancing isn't about your feet, it's about your spirit moving to music. And her spirit? Aye, it could salsa better than anyone." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening he hadn't experienced in months. He watched Tommy straighten slightly, something awakening in his expression. "Could you—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Could you teach me to dance like that?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Jake's throat tightened. Every medical professional had focused on what Tommy couldn't do, what he had lost, what needed to be fixed. But this woman, this stranger, was asking what was still possible. "Of course, mi nieto," Joyce said, the endearment rolling naturally off her tongue. "But not today. Today, you look tired, and I need to learn my way around this enormous house. Tomorrow, though, tomorrow we can start with some shoulder moves, very gentle, just for fun." "Really?" The hope in Tommy's voice was fragile as spun glass. "Really?" Jake found himself staring at Maria, really seeing her for the first time. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something luminous about her face, something that suggested depths he couldn't fathom. When she smiled at Tommy, laugh lines crinkled around her dark eyes, speaking of a life lived fully despite its hardships. "Mr. Gyllenhaal," she said, turning to face him directly, "may I ask you something?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. "When did you last see your son smile? Really smile?" The question hit like a physical blow. Jake's mind raced backward through months of medical appointments, therapy sessions, surgical consultations. He couldn't remember. The realization stole his breath. I started, then stopped, something crumbling inside his chest. Joyce stood, moving closer to Jake with the same gentle approach she had used with Tommy. "Papa," she said again, and this time neither of them corrected her. "Sometimes the healing we seek isn't the healing we need." Their eyes met, his desperate and drowning, hers steady and impossibly warm. In that moment, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident, the possibility that he wasn't alone in his fight to save his son. "I should let you get settled," he said roughly, backing toward the door. But as he reached the threshold, Tommy called out, "Dad, can Joyce stay for lunch? I want to hear more stories about her grandmother." Jake turned back to see his son animated with interest for the first time in 8 months. Joyce was watching him, waiting for his answer, and in her patient gaze, he saw an invitation to hope he wasn't sure he was brave enough to accept. "Yes," he whispered, "she can stay for lunch." As Jake walked down the hall, he heard Joyce's laughter mixing with Tommy's voice, the sound foreign and wonderful in a house that had been silent too long. He pressed his back against the wall, overwhelmed by the strange, terrifying sensation that everything was about to change. For the first time since the accident, Jake Gyllenhaal dared to believe in miracles, though he had no idea the greatest one was just beginning to unfold in his own heart. Building walls. The lunch invitation stretched into an afternoon that Jake couldn't quite explain. He found himself lingering in doorways, listening to Joyce's stories flow like warm honey through rooms that had been sterile and silent for too long. She told Tommy about her grandmother's garden, where every plant had a purpose: mint for stomach aches, lavender for sleep, roses because beauty is medicine too. Tommy hung on every word, asking questions Jake hadn't heard him ask in months. But as evening approached and the spell of the afternoon began to fade, familiar walls started rising in Jake's chest. He found Joyce in the kitchen, moving with quiet efficiency as she prepared dinner. She'd refused Jennifer's offer to show her the elaborate meal planning system, instead opening the massive Sub-Zero refrigerator and creating something that smelled like home from ingredients Jake didn't even know they had. "Miss Meyer," he said, his voice deliberately formal, "about today, I need to clarify some boundaries." Joyce looked up from stirring something fragrant on the stove, her expression neutral but alert. "Of course, Mr. Gyllenhaal." "I need to clarify some boundaries. Tommy's medical care is very structured. Dr. Harrison has specific protocols, timing, repetitions, measurements. I can't have—" He paused, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound cruel. "I can't have well-meaning interference disrupting his progress." Something flickered across Joyce's face, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment, but she only nodded. "I understand. I overstepped today. It won't happen again." Her acquiescence should have relieved him. Instead, it felt like a door closing on something he hadn't realized he wanted to keep open. "It's not personal," Jake continued, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "Tommy has been through extensive trauma. He needs consistency, not not false hope." The wooden spoon in Joyce's hand stilled. When she looked at him, her dark eyes held a sharpness he hadn't expected. "False hope, Mr. Gyllenhaal. Dancing lessons for a paralyzed child? Stories about spirits and miracles? He's been disappointed enough. I won't have you filling his head with impossibilities just because they make you feel useful." The words hung in the air like poison. Joyce set down the spoon carefully, her movements controlled with the precision of someone fighting to maintain dignity in the face of casual cruelty. "I see," she said quietly. "And what would you prefer I fill his head with instead? More medical terms he can't understand? More promises about treatments that might work someday? More reasons to believe his worth is measured by whether his legs function?" Jake's jaw tightened. Those treatments represent hope, real hope, based on science and medicine, not folklore and wishful thinking. $4 million of real hope, Joyce said, her voice still gentle, but now edged with steel. "And how is that working for you, Mr. Gyllenhaal?" The question landed like a slap. Jake felt his face flush with anger and something deeper, perhaps shame, at having his failures enumerated by a woman who cleaned houses for a living. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said coldly. "You've been here one day, and you think you understand my son better than the doctors who've devoted their lives to helping children like him?" "No," Joyce replied, turning back to the stove. "But I understand something they don't." "Which is?" "I understand what it feels like to love someone you can't fix." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. For a moment, the kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of whatever Joyce was cooking, something that smelled like comfort and care and everything Jake had forgotten how to provide. Before he could respond, Tommy's voice echoed from the intercom system. "Dad, is dinner ready? It smells amazing down there." Jake looked at Maria, seeing her properly for perhaps the first time, not as an employee or an intruder, but as a woman who had somehow, in the space of a single afternoon, reminded his son how to be curious about the world. The realization terrified him. "This can't happen again. The connection you made with Tommy today, he gets attached easily, and when people leave, who says I'm leaving?" The question stopped Jake cold. Joyce had turned from the stove again, and something in her expression made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Everyone leaves," Jake said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "The nurses, the therapists, the specialists, they come with their promises and their expertise, and when they realize they can't perform miracles, they move on to easier cases. Tommy has been abandoned by more medical professionals than a child should ever meet." "I'm not a medical professional." "No, you're not. You're a housekeeper. Someone I pay to maintain my home, not to form emotional attachments with my son." The cruelty of his own words hit him immediately, but it was too late to take them back. Joyce's face went very still, and Jake saw the exact moment she decided to retreat behind the same professional distance he was demanding. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Gyllenhaal. I'm just the housekeeper. I'll remember my place from now on." She turned back to the stove, her shoulders rigid with controlled dignity, and Jake felt something precious slip away from him, something he hadn't even realized he'd been reaching for until it was gone. Upstairs, Tommy waited for the dinner that would taste like love, but arrive enwrapped in new rules and careful distances. He'd spent the afternoon feeling more like himself than he had since the accident, laughing at Joyce's stories and forgetting for precious hours that his legs didn't work. But children are intuitive creatures, and as the evening wore on, he would sense the change in atmosphere, the way adults suddenly remembered to treat him like a patient instead of a boy. That night, Jake stood in his study, staring out at grounds that looked cold and perfect in the moonlight. He'd protected Tommy from disappointment, maintained the necessary boundaries, kept their world orderly and controlled. So why did victory feel so much like loss? In her small room in the staff wing, Joyce unpacked her few belongings with careful precision. She'd survived 20 years of cleaning other people's houses, raising other people's children, staying invisible while her own dreams withered. She knew how to be what employers wanted: silent, efficient, forgettable. She could do it again. But as she held her grandmother's cross in her palm, she thought of Tommy's face when she'd mentioned dancing, the way hope had flickered to life in his eyes like a candle in the dark. And she thought of her father's desperate anger, the way he'd attacked her kindness like it was a threat to everything he'd built to keep his son safe. "Diosito," she whispered, "I came here for a job, but maybe I came here for something else too." She tucked the cross under her pillow and tried to sleep, but her dreams were full of music and a little boy who needed to remember that some things couldn't be measured in medical charts. Some things could only be felt in the dancing of the heart. Tomorrow the careful distances would begin. But resistance, Joyce had learned from her grandmother, was often just fear wearing a different dress. And fear, properly understood, was simply love that hadn't yet found its courage. The battle for Tommy's healing and his father's heart was only beginning. We can feel the tension building, can't we? Jake's desperation is making him push away the very thing that might help. What do you think? Is he protecting Tommy or protecting himself? Share your thoughts below as we watch these two wounded souls struggle against the very connection they both need. When distance becomes impossible. 3 days passed in careful politeness. Joyce moved through the mansion like a ghost, efficiently invisible, speaking only when spoken to. She prepared meals that somehow tasted like memories, cleaned rooms until they sparkled, and maintained the perfect professional distance Jake had demanded. Tommy noticed, of course he noticed, and his brief spark of curiosity dimmed back to resigned acceptance. Jake told himself this was better, safer. The house ran smoothly, his son's medical routine remained undisturbed, and he could focus on what mattered: finding the next specialist, the next treatment, the next miracle wrapped in medical degrees and 7-figure price tags. Then, Hurricane Elena changed everything. The weather reports had been tracking the massive storm for days, but no one expected it to strengthen so rapidly or veer so far north. By Thursday evening, emergency broadcasts were urging Manhattan residents to shelter in place as Elena prepared to slam into the coast with devastating force. Jake stood in his study, watching trees bend at impossible angles outside his windows when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The backup generator kicked in immediately. He'd spared no expense on emergency systems, but the main power lines were clearly down. His phone showed no signal. "Dad!" Tommy's voice called from upstairs, tight with fear. Jake rushed up to find his son's room in darkness except for the eerie glow of battery-powered medical equipment. Tommy's ventilator substitute, a machine that helped his weakened diaphragm muscles at night, beeped ominously, running on backup power that Jake knew wouldn't last more than a few hours. "It's okay, buddy," Jake said, trying to keep panic from his voice. "The generator will handle everything." But even as he spoke, he was calculating. The hospital-grade equipment Tommy needed drew enormous power. Even with the mansion's industrial generator, they had maybe 6 hours before critical systems started failing. "Mr. Gyllenhaal?" Joyce's voice came softly from the doorway. She held a flashlight and wore an expression of calm competence that somehow steadied his racing heart. The radio says the main power grid is down across the city. Emergency services aren't responding to non-critical calls." "How long do you think—" Then Jake began, then stopped as Tommy's breathing monitor let out a sharp beep. Joyce moved into the room without hesitation, her flashlight beam finding Tommy's face. "Hey, mi nieto. Big storm, eh? You scared?" Tommy nodded, his breathing shallow and rapid. Whether from machine malfunction or fear, Jake couldn't tell. "You know what my grandmother used to do during storms like this?" Joyce asked, settling beside Tommy's bed. "She would tell stories. Stories so interesting that we forgot to be afraid of the wind." "Miss—" Meyer interrupted, his earlier demands for distance forgotten in the face of crisis. "His breathing, the machine—" "Is working fine," Joyce said calmly, checking the readings with surprising competence. "His fear is making his breathing shallow. That's making the machine work harder." She looked at Jake directly. "Sometimes the medicine we need isn't in the machines." Another gust of wind rattled the windows, and Tommy flinched. The power fluctuated again, and Jake felt his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. "What kind of stories?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the darkness. Joyce's face softened in the flashlight glow. "Stories about a boy who couldn't walk but could fly. Stories about magic that doesn't come from doctors or medicines, but from believing in things you can't see." Jake wanted to object, to maintain the boundaries he'd so carefully constructed, but Tommy's breathing was already steadying. And as the storm raged outside, he found himself desperate for any comfort his son could find. "Tell me," Tommy whispered. As Joyce began to speak, her voice weaving tales of flying boys and dancing spirits, Jake found himself drawn despite his resistance. He sat in a chair beside Tommy's bed, ostensibly monitoring the medical equipment, but actually listening to stories that seemed to cast spells stronger than any medicine. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the generator fuel gauge dropped steadily toward red. Jake's phone remained dead, his usual army of specialists unreachable. For the first time since the accident, he was completely alone with his son's vulnerability, except for the woman whose presence he'd tried so hard to minimize. "Maria," Tommy said during a pause in her storytelling, "why aren't you scared?" "Who says I'm not scared?" she replied gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you don't feel afraid. It means you do what needs to be done even when your heart is beating like a little bird." "What needs to be done now?" Joyce looked at Jake, and in her eyes he saw an invitation to step into the story instead of simply observing it. "Now," she said, "we take care of each other. That's always what needs to be done." The generator sputtered, and for a terrifying moment all the machines went silent. Tommy's breathing monitor flatlined before emergency battery power kicked in, filling the room with urgent beeping. Jake's carefully controlled world cracked open. "We need to get him to a hospital," he said, panic bleeding into his voice. "With what phone?" Joyce said quietly. "On what roads? Mr. Gyllenhaal, the whole city is shut down." The reality hit him like cold water. No amount of money, no connections, no influence could reach them through the storm. They were trapped with failing equipment and his son's life hanging in the balance of battery power and fuel gauges. "I don't know what to do," Jake admitted, the words torn from some deep place he'd kept locked away. "I don't know how to—" "Papa," Joyce said, the endearment slipping out naturally again. "You don't have to know everything. You just have to be here." She moved to the medical cart beside Tommy's bed, her hands sure and steady as she checked connections and settings. "I worked in a clinic before I came north," she said, as if answering Jake's unspoken question. "Nothing fancy, but I learned to read these machines." "You're a trained nurse?" Jake asked, bewildered. Trained by necessity, Joyce corrected. My grandmother needed care the last years of her life. I learned what I had to learn. She adjusted something on Tommy's breathing machine, and the urgent beeping softened to a steady rhythm. Tommy's color improved almost immediately. How did you— The setting was too high, Joyce explained simply. The machine was trying to force breaths instead of supporting them. Sometimes less intervention works better than more. Jake stared at her, this woman he'd dismissed as just a housekeeper who had just accomplished what his team of specialists had been struggling with for months. Tommy was breathing easier than he had in weeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "You didn't ask," Joyce said gently. "You saw what you expected to see. A woman who cleans houses, just like your doctors see a boy who needs to be fixed instead of a child who needs to be loved." The accusation hung in the air, not cruel, but devastatingly accurate. Jake looked at his son, peaceful now despite the storm raging outside, and realized that in 3 days of professional distance, he'd missed what Joyce had seen immediately. Tommy didn't need another medical intervention. He needed to feel safe, valued, and cared for as more than a collection of symptoms. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things." Joyce's smile was soft and forgiving. "We all do what we think is right for the people we love. The trick is staying open to learning better ways." As if summoned by their tentative truce, Tommy's voice emerged from the darkness. "Are you guys going to keep talking all night? Because I'm not sleeping until this storm stops, and I could really use another story." Jake and Joyce looked at each other across his son's bed, and something shifted between them, not quite trust yet, but the possibility of it. Outside, Hurricane Elena continued her assault, but inside Tommy's room, surrounded by the warm circle of flashlight glow, 3 people who had been strangers began the delicate work of becoming family. "What kind of story do you want to hear?" Joyce asked sleepily. "One about second chances and people who find each other when they need it most." Jake met Joyce's eyes again, and this time he didn't look away. "The storm has stripped away all pretenses and forced these 3 souls together. What do you think of seeing Jake's vulnerability emerge and Joyce's hidden depths? Drop a comment and let me know how this forced proximity is affecting you. I can feel the walls are starting to come down." When shadows speak. The storm passed sometime after midnight, leaving the city in darkness, and their small sanctuary changed forever. Jake had dozed fitfully in the chair beside Tommy's bed, jerking awake each time the generator coughed or the medical equipment chirped. But Joyce had remained vigilant through the long hours, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Dawn came gray and subdued, filtering through windows still streaked with rain. The power remained out, but Tommy's equipment hummed steadily, and for the first time in months, Jake's son slept deeply, his breathing natural and unlabored. "Coffee?" Joyce asked softly, appearing in the doorway with 2 steaming mugs. Jake nodded gratefully, accepting the cup and inhaling the rich aroma. "How did you manage this without power?" "Gas stove, old-fashioned percolator from the back of a cabinet," Joyce said, settling into the window seat. "My grandmother taught me to be resourceful." "Your grandmother seems to have taught you many things," Jake observed, studying Joyce's profile in the morning light. "Medical care, cooking, storytelling. What else haven't you told me?" Joyce was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her mug like it could anchor her. "What do you want to know, Mr. Gyllenthal?" "Jake," he said quietly. "After last night, just Jake." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Jake, then. Tell me about the clinic where you learned to read medical equipment." Joyce's face grew still, and Jake sensed he was approaching sacred ground. "It wasn't really a clinic," she said finally. "It was my house. I turned our living room into one when Abuela got sick." She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-ravaged gardens. Diabetes, kidney failure, heart problems. The doctor said she had 6 months. I made it 3 years. 3 years of caring for her alone? Not alone. The community helped when they could, but mostly alone. Joyce's voice carried no self-pity, only quiet strength. I learned to give injections, manage her medications, operate the dialysis machine we rented. I learned to read her body signals better than any monitor. You felt something crack open in your chest? That's why you knew how to adjust Tommy's breathing machine. Machines are just tools, Joyce said simply. They measure what's happening, but they can't tell you why. For that, you have to pay attention to the person, not the equipment. And your grandmother? She's the one who couldn't walk but taught you to dance? Yes. Joyce's smile was sad and beautiful. Even at the end, when she could barely speak, she would move her hands to music only she could hear. She said the soul dances whether the body cooperates or not. Jake stood and joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of vanilla and warmth that seemed to surround her. Is that why you came here? To help Tommy the way you helped her? I came here because I needed a job, Joyce said honestly. I was about to be evicted, but when I saw Tommy yesterday, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I saw my grandmother's eyes in his face, that look of someone who's been told they're broken when they're just different. Different how? Joyce turned to face him fully, and Jake was struck by the intensity in her dark eyes. Your son isn't disabled, Jake. He's waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to see him as whole instead of wounded. For someone to ask what he can do instead of cataloging what he can't. For someone to love him exactly as he is right now, not as he might become someday. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and he felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble. I do love him. Everything I've done, the doctors, the treatments, the money, has been about trying to change him, Joyce said gently but firmly. When did you last ask Tommy what he wants? What makes him happy? What he dreams about that has nothing to do with walking? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but closed it. When had he last asked his son about anything except pain levels and therapy progress? When had they talked about dreams instead of diagnoses? He used to want to be a soccer player, Jake said quietly. And now? Now he doesn't want anything. He just endures. Because he's learned that his worth is measured by his ability to meet your expectations, Joyce said, and right now those expectations are all about his legs. The truth of it nearly drove Jake to his knees. I just want him to be normal, to have the life he was supposed to have. Whose life? Joyce asked. The one you planned for him or the one he's actually living? Before Jake could answer, a sound from behind them made them turn. Tommy was awake, sitting up in bed, and his expression suggested he'd heard more than they realized. How long have you been listening? Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion. Long enough, Tommy said quietly. Dad, do you really think I'm broken? The question shattered something in Jake's chest. He moved to his son's bedside, kneeling so they were at eye level. No, son. God, no. You're perfect. You're everything to me. Then why do you keep trying to fix me? The simple honesty of the question destroyed Jake's last pretenses. Tears he'd held back for 8 months spilled down his cheeks as he reached for Tommy's hands. I'm scared, he whispered, because I don't know how to protect you from a world that sees wheelchairs before it sees the amazing boy sitting in one. Maybe you could teach the world to see better instead of teaching me to hide, Tommy said, his voice older than his 10 years. Jake looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a patient to be cured, but a brave, thoughtful boy who had somehow maintained his wisdom despite everything Jake had put him through in the name of healing. Tommy, Jake said, his voice breaking, what do you want? Not what the doctors want, not what I want. What do you want? Tommy glanced at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. I want to learn to dance with my hands like Joyce's grandmother. I want to read stories instead of medical journals. I want to have friends over without you asking if their parents know about my condition first. He paused, gathering courage. And I want you to stop looking at me like I'm dying. You're not dying, Jake said fiercely. I know that, but you act like I am. Like every day might be my last, so we have to spend it all trying to make my legs work instead of enjoying the parts of me that already do. Jake buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd been blind to. In his desperate quest to restore his son's mobility, he'd forgotten to nurture his son's spirit. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I thought I was saving you, but I was drowning us both, Joy said softly, moving to place a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. But now you know better, and knowing better means you can do better. Jake looked up at her, this woman who had seen through his wealth and desperation, to the father who was failing his son out of love instead of neglect. How do I start over? How do I learn to see him the way you do? You start by listening. You start by asking questions that have nothing to do with medicine. You start by remembering that healing isn't always about going back. Sometimes it's about going forward. Will you help us? Tommy asked, looking between his father and Maria. Will you teach us both how to dance with our spirits? Sí, mi nieto. If your father wants to learn, I'll teach you both. Jake met her gaze, and in her dark eyes, he saw not just the promise of his son's healing, but the possibility of his own. For the first time since the accident, he dared to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what they'd lost, but by what they still had to discover. Please, he said simply, teach us. Outside, the morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds, filling Tommy's room with golden light, and in that brightness, 3 hearts that had been broken in different ways began the delicate work of learning to beat in harmony. The truth is finally out. Jake's desperation has been revealed as misdirected love, and Tommy's wisdom shines through. What do you think about this moment of raw honesty between father and son? Share your thoughts below. This is where real healing begins. The medicine of connection. The power returned that evening, but something had fundamentally shifted in the mansion that no amount of electricity could illuminate. Jake found himself lingering in rooms where Joyce worked, not to supervise, but to listen, to her humming Spanish lullabies as she folded laundry, to her gentle corrections of his pronunciation when she taught him simple phrases, to the way she spoke to Tommy as if his thoughts and dreams mattered more than his medical charts. 3 days after the storm, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. Tommy, he said, wheeling his son out to the garden where Joyce was tending to storm-damaged roses, I canceled your appointment with Dr. Harrison. Tommy looked up sharply. Why? Are we seeing someone else instead? No, Jake said, settling onto a garden bench beside Maria. We're taking a break from doctors for a while. Joy suggested we focus on a different kind of therapy for a while. Joyce glanced up from the roses, soil staining her fingers, surprise flickering across her face. Jake, I never said I didn't have to say it. You showed me. When you adjusted his breathing machine, when you helped him sleep peacefully for the first time in months, when you made him laugh. He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. When you reminded me that my son is still a little boy who needs to play more than he needs to be poked and prodded. Tommy's eyes widened. Really? No more appointments for a while? Really? Jake confirmed. Instead, Joyce is going to teach us both some new things, starting with, what did you call it? Baile del alma, Joyce said softly, dancing of the soul. I don't know how to dance, Jake admitted, feeling suddenly vulnerable. Neither did I, Tommy said, grinning, but Joyce says dancing isn't about your feet anyway. Joyce set down her gardening tools and moved to Tommy's wheelchair, her movements fluid and graceful. Show your father what you learned yesterday, mi nieto. Jake watched in amazement as Tommy began to move his arms in flowing patterns, his upper body swaying to music only he could hear. There was something mesmerizing about the movements, not the rigid exercises prescribed by physical therapists, but something organic and joyful that seemed to come from deep within his son's spirit. "The music is in here," Tommy explained, tapping his chest as he moved. "Joyce taught me to find it." "Now you try, Papa," Joyce said, turning to Jake with an encouraging smile. Jake felt heat flood his cheeks. "I don't think—" "Close your eyes," Joyce instructed gently. "Listen to what your heart is feeling right now. Happy? Sad? Worried? Grateful?" Jake closed his eyes obediently, immediately aware of Joyce's presence beside him, the warmth radiating from her skin, the soft sound of her breathing, the faint scent of roses that clung to her hair. "Grateful," Jake said quietly. "And scared." "Good," Joyce said. "Now move your hands like gratitude feels like. What does it look like when your heart says thank you?" Jake felt foolish at first, but as he began to move his arms in slow, tentative gestures, something shifted inside him. The movements became more natural, more honest, until he was conducting an invisible orchestra of emotions he'd kept buried for months. "Beautiful, Dad," Tommy called out. "Now try scared." Jake's movements changed, becoming tighter, more protective. Without thinking, his arms curved around his chest as if shielding something precious. "And now," Joyce said softly, stepping closer, "show me what love looks like." Jake opened his eyes to find Joyce watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his arms outward, palms up, as if offering everything he had to the world. "Perfect," Joyce whispered, her own arms moving in a graceful response that somehow completed his gesture. For a moment, they stood frozen in a dance of connection, their eyes locked, their hearts beating in rhythm with something larger than both of them. Jake felt exposed and exhilarated, as if Joyce could see straight through to his soul and found it beautiful despite its flaws. "Together now," Tommy called out, breaking the spell. "All three of us." They spent the next hour moving together in the garden, creating patterns of gesture and meaning that had nothing to do with medical necessity and everything to do with the simple joy of being alive. "This is better than any therapy session," Jake admitted as they finally collapsed onto the grass, breathless and grinning. "This is therapy," Joyce corrected gently, "just a different kind, healing the parts of us that can't be seen on X-rays." As the afternoon wore on, they talked about things that had nothing to do with Tommy's condition. Joyce told them about her dreams of opening a small restaurant someday, serving the recipes her grandmother had taught her. Tommy confessed that he'd always wanted to try painting, but had been afraid he'd be bad at it. Jake found himself sharing memories of his own childhood, how he had wanted to be a teacher before family expectations pushed him toward business. "What's stopping you now?" Joyce asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "From teaching?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I suppose nothing, really. I have enough money to last several lifetimes. I could do anything I wanted." "So why don't you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Jake looked at his son, who was lying on his back watching clouds drift overhead, and realized that Tommy wasn't the only one who had been imprisoned by expectations and fears. "Maybe I will," Jake said quietly. "Maybe it's time for both of us to start over." As the evening approached, they moved inside to prepare dinner together, something Jake had never done before. Joyce taught them to make empanadas, her grandmother's recipe, and Jake discovered that cooking was its own form of dance, requiring rhythm and intuition and the willingness to trust the process. "Careful with the dough," Joyce instructed, her hands covering Jake's as she showed him how to roll the pastry. "Too much pressure and it becomes tough, too little and it falls apart." Jake was acutely aware of her touch, the way her fingers guided his with gentle authority. When she stepped away, he felt the absence like a physical loss. "Like this, Thad?" Tommy asked, holding up his own imperfect empanada. "Perfect," Jake said, meaning it. "Absolutely perfect." They ate by candlelight, even though the power was working, Joyce's suggestion to make it special. The empanadas were crispy and warm, filled with seasoned beef and stories about Joyce's childhood in Esperanza. Tommy peppered her with questions about Mexico, about her family, about traditions Jake had never thought to explore. "Will you teach me Spanish?" Tommy asked as they cleared the dishes. "Of course, mi amor. What do you want to learn first?" "How to say I'm happy in Spanish." "Estoy feliz," Joyce said, her pronunciation musical. "Estoy feliz," Tommy repeated, carefully, then grinned. "I like how it sounds, like the words are smiling." Jake watched this exchange, his heart full to bursting. When had his son last declared himself happy? When had their home last echoed with laughter instead of medical equipment? Later, as they tucked Tommy into bed, the boy reached for both their hands. "This was the best day I had since the accident," he said simply. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" "Every day," Jake promised, then looked at Maria. "If Joyce doesn't mind teaching two very slow students." "I don't mind," Joyce said softly. "I like who you both become when you're dancing." After Tommy fell asleep, Jake and Joyce found themselves on the terrace, sharing coffee and comfortable silence under a sky full of stars. The storm had cleared the air, leaving everything crisp and bright with possibility. "Thank you," Jake said finally, "for today, for showing us how to be a family again." "You were always a family," Joyce replied. "You just forgot how to see it." "And you? Do you feel like part of it now?" The question was loaded with meaning they both understood. Joyce was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing patterns on her coffee cup. "I feel like I'm home," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." Jake reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. "Then stay," he said simply. "Not as an employee, as whatever this is becoming." Joyce looked down at their joined hands, and Jake saw tears glistening in her eyes. "What about all those boundaries you insisted on? All that talk about maintaining professional distance?"
"I was wrong about a lot of things," Jake admitted. "But I was wrong about that most of all. Professional distance is the last thing I want from you." "What do you want, Jake?" The question hung between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Jake looked into Joyce's eyes and saw his future reflected there, not the lonely, desperate existence he'd been living, but something warm and whole and infinitely precious. "I want to learn to dance with you," he said quietly, "in every way that matters." Joyce's smile was radiant as starlight. "Then we'll dance," she whispered, "all three of us, together." As they sat under the vast sky, hands entwined, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope for medical miracles, but the quiet, steady hope of a heart learning to trust in love again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new steps in the dance they were creating together. But tonight, under the stars, three hearts beat in perfect harmony, and that was miracle enough. Can you feel the love growing between them? This bonding is so beautiful and authentic, built on shared vulnerability and genuine care. What's your favorite moment from this act? Let me know in the comments as we head toward the emotional climax. When love becomes betrayal. 2 weeks of blissful normalcy passed like a dream. Jake had never known his mansion could feel so much like a home, filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of genuine connection. Tommy thrived under Joyce's gentle guidance, his spirit brightening daily as he discovered new ways to express himself through art, music, and movement. And Jake was falling in love. not just with Joyce's kindness or her remarkable intuition with Tommy, but with the man he became when she was near. She saw past his wealth and desperation to something he'd forgotten existed. A father who could laugh, a man who could trust, a heart capable of dancing. He should have known it was too good to last. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Joyce was teaching Tommy to paint watercolors in the sunroom. Jake's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. Cold, professional, devastating. "Mr. Gyllenhaal, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Mayo Clinic. I've been reviewing your son's case files, and I believe I have a solution you'll want to hear about." Jake's pulse quickened despite himself. "Dr. Vasquez, I appreciate your interest, but we're taking a break from medical consultations right now." "Mr. Gyllenhaal," she interrupted, her tone sharp with authority, "I've developed a revolutionary spinal cord regeneration therapy. Early trials show an 87% success rate in patients with injuries similar to your son's. But there's a very narrow window for treatment effectiveness. Patients must begin therapy within 10 months of their initial trauma." 10 months? Jake asked. "Your son's accident was 8 months ago. We have perhaps 6 weeks before the window closes permanently. After that, no amount of money or medical intervention will be able to help him." Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet. 6 weeks. A deadline he'd never known existed, suddenly making every moment precious and terrifying. "What does the therapy involve?" 3 months of intensive treatment here in Minnesota, round-the-clock monitoring, experimental stem cell infusions, neural pathway reconstruction. It's not pleasant, but Mr. Gyllenhaal, your son could walk again, really walk, run, play soccer, live a completely normal life. The words Jake had dreamed of hearing for 8 months crashed over him like a tsunami. Tommy could be normal. Tommy could have the future Jake had always planned for him. All the money, all the searching, all the desperate hope, it could finally mean something. "I'll need to think about it," Jake managed. "Mr. Gyllenhaal," Dr. Vasquez said firmly, "thinking time is a luxury your son doesn't have. Every day we delay reduces the chances of success. I can have a medical transport ready this afternoon." "This afternoon?" Jake's voice cracked. "That's impossible. I need to prepare him to what? To convince a 10-year-old boy to undergo painful treatment? Mr. Gyllenhaal, children don't understand what's at stake. That's why parents make these decisions for them." Jake ended the call with shaking hands and stood frozen in his study, staring out at the sunroom where Tommy's laughter mingled with Joyce's gentle encouragement. His son was painting something colorful and abstract, his face bright with concentration and joy. "Just a little more blue there, mi nieto," Joyce was saying. "See how it makes the whole picture come alive." Jake watched them together, and for a moment, the scene was so perfect he could barely breathe. Then Dr. Vasquez's words echoed in his mind. 6 weeks, 87% success rate, a normal life? How could he not pursue this? How could he let his son remain paralyzed when a cure might be within reach? But even as the rational arguments formed in his mind, his heart rebelled. The past 2 weeks had shown him that Tommy wasn't suffering. He was thriving. He was happy, creative, engaged with life in ways Jake had never seen before Joyce arrived. Jake found himself thinking of Joyce's gentle wisdom. Sometimes the healing we seek isn't the healing we need. But this was different. This was real medicine, real hope, not just emotional band-aids and wishful thinking. This could give Tommy back everything the accident had stolen. The internal war raged for hours. Jake paced his study, picked up the phone to call Dr. Vasquez back a dozen times, then set it down again. He thought of Tommy's smile this morning as he'd mastered a new painting technique. He thought of Joyce's laugh when Tommy had insisted on teaching her a song he'd made up. He thought of the life they were building together, imperfect, unconventional,
but somehow more real than anything Jake had ever experienced. Then, he thought of Tommy in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, of the limitations he'd face, the dreams he'd have to abandon, the world that would see his disability before his brilliance. As evening approached, Jake made his decision. He found Joyce and Tommy in the kitchen preparing dinner together. Tommy was chopping vegetables with careful precision while Joyce seasoned something that smelled like heaven. They looked up when he entered, and Jake's heart clenched at their welcoming smiles. "Dad, look, I'm getting really good with the knife. Joyce says I have steady hands like a surgeon." "That's wonderful, son," Jake said, his voice strained. "Tommy, I need to talk to you about something important." Something in his tone made both Tommy and Joyce go still. Joyce set down her wooden spoon, her dark eyes searching Jake's face with growing concern. "What is it, Dad?" Jake sat beside his son, his hands clenched in his lap. "I got a call today from a doctor in Minnesota. She's developed a new treatment that could help your legs work again." Tommy's face went carefully blank. "Another doctor?" "This one is different, son. This treatment has an 87% success rate. Tommy, you could walk again. You could run, play soccer, do everything you used to love." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake looked between Tommy and Maria, desperate for the excitement and hope he'd expected to see. Instead, he found confusion and something that looked disturbingly like betrayal. "I thought," Tommy said slowly, "we were done with doctors for a while." "We were, but this is different. This could change everything." "Everything is already changed," Joyce said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. "Tommy is happy now. He's creating, learning, growing." "He's still paralyzed," Jake snapped, frustration bleeding through his careful composure. "Whatever progress we've made, whatever happiness he's found, it doesn't change the fact that he can't walk." Joyce flinched, as if he'd slapped her. "And if he never walks again, what then? Is his life meaningless? Is he worth less than a child who can run?" "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant, Joyce," said Joyce, her own composure cracking. "Everything we've built here, everything Tommy has accomplished, it's not enough for you, is it? Because it doesn't involve him being normal. I want him to have every opportunity. You want him to be the son you plan to have, not the son you actually have." Tommy had gone very quiet, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Do I have to go, Dad?" The question broke Jake's heart, but Dr. Vasquez's words echoed in his mind. 6 weeks. The window is closing. "The treatment has to start soon," Jake said carefully. "If we wait too long, it won't work anymore." "But do I have to go?" Tommy repeated, looking up with eyes that held too much understanding for a 10-year-old. Jake met his son's gaze and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. "Yes," he whispered, "we're leaving tomorrow morning." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tommy nodded slowly, his face carefully expressionless in the way Jake recognized from the months right after the accident. The look of a child who had learned that his own wants and feelings didn't matter. "Tommy," Joyce started, reaching for him. "It's okay," Tommy said, pulling away from her touch. "Dad knows what's best for me. He always does." The quiet resignation in his son's voice was worse than any tantrum would have been. Jake wanted to explain, to make him understand that this was love, not betrayal. But the words died in his throat. Joyce stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to pack," she said, her voice hollow. "Pack?" Jake asked, confused. "You won't need a housekeeper in Minnesota," Joyce said, not meeting his eyes. "I'll be gone before you leave in the morning." The finality in her tone hit Jake like a physical blow. "Maria, wait! You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she said, turning to face him with tears streaming down her cheeks. I thought you had learned to see your son for who he is instead of what he lacks. I thought you understood that love means accepting people as they are, not constantly trying to change them." "This is love," Jake said desperately. "Everything I'm doing is because I love him." "No," Joyce said, her voice breaking. "This is fear. Fear that Tommy isn't good enough as he is. Fear that you aren't good enough as his father unless you can fix him. Fear that maybe, just maybe, happiness doesn't require perfection." She looked at Tommy, her expression infinitely tender. "Goodbye, mi nieto. Remember what I taught you about dancing. Your spirit is perfect exactly as it is." Tommy's careful composure finally cracked. "Maria, please don't go. Please." "I have to, baby. But I want you to remember something, okay? You are not broken. You are not less than. You are a beautiful, whole, perfect boy exactly as you are right now." She kissed his forehead gently, then stood and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. She heard her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of her door closing, and then silence. He was alone with his son in the kitchen that felt vast and cold despite the warmth from the stove. Tommy sat motionless in his wheelchair, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. "Tommy," Jake said, reaching for him. "Son, this is going to be good. You'll see, when you can walk again." "I don't want to walk again," Tommy said quietly. The words stopped Jake cold. "What?" "I don't want to walk again if it means losing Maria. I don't want to be normal if normal means you can't love me the way I am right now." Tommy looked up at his father with eyes that held more wisdom than Jake had ever possessed. "She's right, Dad. You're scared. And your fear is hurting the people who love us." Jake felt his world crumble around him. In pursuing the miracle he thought his son needed, he had destroyed the miracle they had already found. The cure he was chasing required sacrificing the very things that had made Tommy whole again: his joy, his sense of worth, his belief that he was loved unconditionally. And Maria who had shown them both how to dance, how to hope, how to find beauty in imperfection. He had driven her away with his inability to see the perfection that already existed. Upstairs, he could hear the sounds of packing. Soon, she would be gone, and tomorrow he would take Tommy to Minnesota to be poked and prodded and possibly healed in body while remaining forever broken in spirit. Jake buried his face in his hands and wept for the paradise he had destroyed in his desperate quest to create a different one. And in the silence that followed, he finally understood what Joyce had been trying to teach him all along. Love was not about fixing people. Love was about seeing them as already whole. But the understanding had come too late. The transport would arrive in the morning, and Joyce would be gone, and the dance they had been learning together would end before they discovered where it might have led them. My heart is breaking for all three of them. Jake's desperation has destroyed the very happiness he was trying to protect. Do you think there's still hope for them? Let me know in the comments. This shatter point is where real transformation begins, but will Jake choose love over fear? When hearts must choose. The medical transport arrived at dawn, a sterile white van that looked more like a hearse than a vehicle of hope. Jake stood at his bedroom window, still in yesterday's clothes, watching two uniformed paramedics unload a stretcher and wheelchair-accessible equipment. He hadn't slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen Joyce's tears, heard Tommy's quiet resignation, felt the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Joyce's room had been silent since midnight. Jake had knocked twice during the long night, but she hadn't answered. When he'd pressed his ear to the door, he'd heard nothing. Not packing, not crying, not the soft prayers in Spanish he'd grown accustomed to hearing through thin walls. Just silence, which somehow felt worse than anger. "Mr. Gyllenhaal?" One of the paramedics knocked on the front door. "We're here for the transport to Mayo Clinic." Jake's hands shook as he straightened his tie. Everything was arranged. The best doctors money could hire. A private room overlooking a lake. Experimental treatments that could change everything. Tommy's bags were packed with clothes, books, and the tablet loaded with educational games. Everything except the watercolor paintings he'd been working on, the Spanish vocabulary cards Joyce had made him, the photo of the three of them laughing in the garden that now felt like evidence of a crime. He found Tommy in the sunroom, sitting motionless in his wheelchair, staring out at the garden where they'd learned to dance. His son was dressed in his best clothes, the navy suit Jake had bought for medical appointments, the shoes he couldn't feel on his feet. He looked like he was going to a funeral. "Ready, son?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from the sleepless night. Tommy didn't look at him. "Is Joyce really gone?" Jake checked his watch, stalling. The transport team was waiting. Dr. Vasquez expected them by afternoon. Every minute they delayed reduced Tommy's chances of walking again. "She left early this morning," Jake lied, because the truth, that he hadn't actually seen her leave, just assumed she had, felt too complicated to explain. "Without saying goodbye?" The pain in Tommy's voice was a knife to Jake's heart. She said goodbye last night." "She said goodbye to me," Tommy said quietly. "Not to you." Before Jake could respond, Tommy spoke again, his voice carrying a maturity that shouldn't have existed in a 10-year-old. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you remember what you were like before the accident?" "What do you mean?" "You were always working, always on your phone, always stressed about money and deals and stuff I didn't understand. You barely had time to throw a football with me, and when you did, you kept checking your watch. You weren't happy then, either." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's not true, Tommy. I was working hard to provide for us." "You were working hard because you didn't know how to be still," Tommy interrupted. "Joyce told me that some people run toward things they want, and some people run away from things they're scared of. You've been running away your whole life, Dad. First from being poor like when you were little, then from the accident, now from accepting that maybe this is who we're supposed to be." The words hit Jake like physical blows. When had his son become so wise? When had he learned to see through the justifications Jake had been telling himself for years? "The accident changed everything," Jake said weakly. "No, Dad, Joyce changed everything. The accident just broke my legs, but Joyce showed us how to be a family." A knock on the door interrupted them. "Mr. Gyllenhaal, we really need to get moving. Traffic into the city is getting heavy." Jake looked at his son, who was still staring out the window with the patient resignation of someone who had learned not to hope for anything better than survival. The transport team was waiting. Dr. Vasquez was waiting. The experimental treatment that could restore Tommy's mobility was waiting. But Joyce was gone, and Tommy looked like he was already mourning his own life. "Give me 5 minutes," Jake called to the paramedics. "I need to make a call." He pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Vasquez's number with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Dr. Vasquez, it's Jake Gyllenhaal. About the treatment." "Oh, excellent! Are you en route? I have the surgical suite prepared for initial testing this afternoon. That's what I'm calling about. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "The 87% success rate you mentioned, what does success mean exactly?" "Mr. Gyllenhaal, we discussed this." "No, we didn't. You said Tommy could walk again, but what does that actually look like? Will he be able to run, play soccer, or will he be able to stand for a few minutes at a time with assistance?" Mr. Gyllenhaal, any improvement in mobility should be considered a victory." "Answer the question, doctor. What does success look like?" Dr. Vasquez's sigh was audible through the phone. "Full restoration of mobility occurs in approximately 30% of cases. The remaining successful cases show varying degrees of improvement: assisted walking, some sensation returning, improved muscle control. But Mr. Gyllenhaal, even partial improvement could significantly enhance your son's quality of life. And the failures? The 13% where the treatment doesn't work? Well, naturally, any experimental treatment carries risks. What risks? In rare cases, patients experience setbacks. Sometimes the trauma of intensive treatment can result in temporary regression in areas where the patient had previously been functioning well. But Mr. Gyllenhaal, you must understand that without treatment— I ended the call without listening to the rest. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. 30%. 30% chance of Tommy actually running and playing soccer again. 57% chance of some improvement that might or might not be meaningful. 13% chance of making things worse. And a 100% chance of destroying the happiness they had already found. He looked at Tommy, who was still staring out the window with the patient resignation of someone who had learned not to hope for anything better than survival. "Tommy," he said, his voice cracking, "what if I told you we didn't have to go?" Tommy turned slowly, and for the first time that morning, something flickered in his eyes. "What do you mean?"
What if I told you that I've been wrong about almost everything? That watching you paint and laugh and learn Spanish has been the happiest I've ever been? That seeing you discover you can express yourself and create beautiful things and make people smile has shown me that maybe you're already perfect, exactly as you are. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "Dad? What if I told you that I don't care if you never walk again as long as you never stop dancing the way Joyce taught you? That I'd rather have a son who can't use his legs but knows he's loved than a son who can run but believes he's only valuable if he meets my expectations?" "Dad, are you saying?" "I'm saying I choose you, Tommy. Not the version of you I thought I wanted, but the real you. The boy who paints watercolors and speaks Spanish and sees magic in ordinary moments. I'm saying I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was right in front of me." Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "But the treatment, Dr. Vasquez said—" "Dr. Vasquez doesn't know you like I do. She doesn't know that you've already learned to fly." Jake knelt beside his son's wheelchair, taking Tommy's hands in his own. "I've spent 8 months trying to fix you, and you were never broken. I was the one who was broken by fear, by expectations, by the belief that love meant changing people instead of celebrating them. So we're not going to Minnesota? Not unless you want to, and even if you do want to try the treatment someday, it will be your choice, not my desperate attempt to make myself feel like a better father." Tommy threw his arms around Jake's neck, holding him with a strength that had nothing to do with muscles and everything to do with heart. "I don't want to go, Dad. I want to stay here. I want to paint and learn Spanish and dance with my soul." "Then we stay," Jake whispered into his son's hair. "We stay and we figure out how to be happy with the life we actually have instead of mourning the one we lost." "But Joyce is gone," Tommy said, pulling back to look at his father. "She left because she thought you couldn't love us as we are." Jake felt his heart crack open with possibility and terror. Maybe she didn't leave. Maybe she's waiting to see what choice I'd make. Really? Only one way to find out. Jake stood and walked to the front door, where the paramedics were waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Gentlemen, I'm sorry for the confusion, but we won't be needing transport today." "Sir, I don't understand. We were told this was urgent medical transport." "It was urgent," Jake said, looking back at Tommy, who was watching him with shining eyes. "And I just realized the most urgent thing was making sure my son knows he's perfect exactly as he is." After the confused paramedics left, Jake and Tommy sat in the sudden quiet of their sunroom, listening to birds sing in the garden where they'd learned that healing had nothing to do with walking and everything to do with being seen. "Now what?" Tommy asked. "Now," Jake said,
We go find Joyce and ask her to teach us the rest of the dance. What if she really did leave? Jake smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Then we go to Mexico and learn to salsa until she forgives us. Tommy laughed, the sound Jake had missed most in the world. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Exactly as you are, always. And for the first time since the accident, Jake Gyllenhaal felt like a father worth having, not because he could fix his son's legs, but because he had finally learned to see his son's heart. The choice was made. Now all that remained was discovering whether love could heal the wounds that fear had opened, and whether a woman who believed in dancing souls might be willing to give them one more chance to get the steps right. What if I told you that I've been wrong about almost everything? That watching you paint and laugh and learn Spanish has been the happiest I've ever been? That seeing you discover you can express yourself and create beautiful things and make people smile has shown me that maybe you're already perfect, exactly as you are? Tommy's eyes filled with tears. Dad? What if I told you that I don't care if you never walk again, as long as you never stop dancing the way Joyce taught you? That I'd rather have a son who can't use his legs but knows he's loved than a son who can run but believes he's only valuable if he meets my expectations? Dad, are you saying? I'm saying I choose you, Tommy. Not the version of you I thought I wanted, but the real you, the boy who paints watercolors and speaks Spanish and sees magic in ordinary moments. I'm saying I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was right in front of me. Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his face. But the treatment, Dr. Vasquez said. Dr. Vasquez doesn't know you like I do. She doesn't know that you've already learned to fly. Jake knelt beside his son's wheelchair, taking Tommy's hands in his own. I've spent 8 months trying to fix you, and you were never broken. I was the one who was broken. Broken by fear, by expectations, by the belief that love meant changing people instead of celebrating them. So, we're not going to Minnesota? Not unless you want to. And even if you do want to try the treatment someday, it will be your choice, not my desperate attempt to make myself feel like a better father. Dad, are you saying? I'm saying I choose you, Tommy. Not the version of you I thought I wanted, but the real you. The boy who paints watercolors and speaks Spanish and sees magic in ordinary moments. I'm saying I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was right in front of me. Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his face. But the treatment, Dr. Vasquez said. Dr. Vasquez doesn't know you like I do. She doesn't know that you've already learned to fly. Jake knelt beside his son's wheelchair, taking Tommy's hands in his own. I've spent 8 months trying to fix you, and you were never broken. I was the one who was broken. Broken by fear, by expectations, by the belief that love meant changing people instead of celebrating them. So, we're not going to Minnesota? Not unless you want to. And even if you do want to try the treatment someday, it will be your choice, not my desperate attempt to make myself feel like a better father. Dad, I don't want to go, Dad. I want to stay here. I want to paint and learn Spanish and dance with my soul. Then we stay, Jake whispered into his son's hair. We stay, and we figure out how to be happy with the life we actually have, instead of mourning the one we lost. But Joyce gone, Tommy said, pulling back to look at his father. She left because she thought you couldn't love us as we are. Jake felt his heart crack open with possibility and terror. Maybe she didn't leave. Maybe she's waiting to see what choice I'd make. Really? Only one way to find out. Jake stood and walked to the front door, where the paramedics were waiting with barely concealed impatience. Gentlemen, I'm sorry for the confusion, but we won't be needing transport today. Sir, I don't understand. We were told this was urgent medical transport. It was urgent, Jake said, looking back at Tommy, who was watching him with shining eyes. And I just realized the most urgent thing was making sure my son knows he's perfect exactly as he is. After the confused paramedics left, Jake and Tommy sat in the sudden quiet of their sunroom, listening to birds sing in the garden, where they learned that healing had nothing to do with walking and everything to do with being seen. Now what? Tommy asked. Now, Jake said, we go find Joyce and ask her to teach us the rest of the dance. What if she really did leave? Jake smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Then we go to Mexico and learn to salsa until she forgives us. Tommy laughed, the sound Jake had missed most in the world. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Exactly as you are, always. And for the first time since the accident, Jake Gyllenhaal felt like a father worth having, not because he could fix his son's legs, but because he had finally learned to see his son's heart. The choice was made. Now all that remained was discovering whether love could heal the wounds that fear had opened, and whether a woman who believed in dancing souls might be willing to give them one more chance to get the steps right. When souls find their rhythm. Joyce hadn't left. Jake discovered this when he and Tommy went searching for her an hour later, their hearts heavy with the possibility that she might truly be gone. They found her in the kitchen garden behind the mansion, kneeling among the herbs she'd been tending since the storm, her suitcase sitting unopened beside the rosemary bushes. She looked up when she heard Tommy's wheelchair on the gravel path, and Jake saw that her eyes were red from crying, but clear with resolve. "You're still here," Tommy breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "I'm still here," Joyce confirmed softly. "We're not going to Minnesota," Tommy announced, rolling his chair closer to her. "Dad realized that I'm already perfect." Joyce's eyes flicked to Jake, searching his face for the truth behind Tommy's words. What she found there made her breath catch. Not the desperate determination she'd seen for weeks, but something quieter and infinitely more powerful. "Is that true?" she asked. Jake moved to stand beside his son, his hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I called Dr. Vasquez this morning and canceled the treatment." "Jake," Joyce's voice was carefully neutral, "you don't have to make grand gestures to prove a point. If you think this treatment could help Tommy..." "The only thing I think could help Tommy is having a father who sees him as a gift instead of a problem to be solved." Joyce stood slowly, brushing soil from her knees, her dark eyes never leaving Jake's face. "And what changed your mind?" "Tommy did. You did. The realization that I've been so busy trying to give him back the life he lost that I completely missed the beautiful life he was actually living." Jake stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of roses and vanilla that had become as essential to him as breathing. "Maria, I've spent 8 months believing that love meant fixing people. You taught me that love means seeing people as already whole." "And if he never walks again?" Joyce asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "If this is as good as it gets? Wheelchair, limitations, a world that doesn't always understand." "Then we'll teach the world to understand," Jake said simply. "The same way you taught me." Tommy had been watching this exchange with the intense focus of someone whose happiness hung in the balance. Now he spoke up, his young voice carrying hard-won wisdom. "Maria, Dad finally figured out what you've been trying to tell us, that dancing isn't about your feet, it's about your heart. And our hearts are fine." Joyce's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt beside Tommy's wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. "Oh, mi nieto, your heart has always been more than fine. Your heart is magic." "So is yours," Tommy said solemnly, "and so is Dad's, even though it took him a while to remember." Joyce looked up at Jake, and in her eyes he saw forgiveness, hope, and something deeper that made his pulse race with possibility. "I have something to confess," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's that?" "I wasn't just crying because you were taking Tommy away for treatment. I was crying because..." She paused, gathering courage. "Because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with both of you.
with the family we became together, and I was terrified that you'd never see it as enough." Jake's breath caught. "Maria, I know it's complicated," she rushed on. "I know I'm just the housekeeper and you're not just anything," Jake said fiercely, dropping to one knee beside her so they were at eye level. "You're the woman who saved my son's spirit. You're the woman who taught me how to be a father. You're the woman I've been falling in love with since the moment you told me that sometimes the healing we seek isn't the healing we need." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile as spun glass. Joyce's eyes searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, and finding none. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Are you sure you can love us as we are? No more chasing miracles, no more trying to change what doesn't need changing?" Instead of answering with words, Jake stood and held out his hand to her. When she took it, he helped her to her feet, then stepped back and began to move his arms in the slow, graceful patterns she'd taught him weeks ago. "This is gratitude," he said, his movements flowing like water, "for showing me that my son was never broken." Joyce's eyes lit up with understanding, and she began to move with him, her arms creating spirals of possibility in the air. "This is hope," she said, her arms creating spirals of possibility in the air, "for the family we're becoming." Tommy watched for a moment, then began his own dance from his wheelchair, his upper body swaying and his arms painting joy across the garden air. "And this," Tommy called out, laughing as he moved, "is love, the kind that doesn't need fixing because it's already perfect." They danced together in the herb garden as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, three souls who had found their rhythm at last. No music played except the symphony of their hearts beating in time. No audience watched except the roses that had survived the storm to bloom more beautiful than before. When they finally stopped moving, they were breathless and grinning, their faces bright with the kind of happiness that couldn't be bought or prescribed or surgically repaired. "So what happens now?" Joyce asked, still holding Jake's hand. "Now," Jake said, "we go inside and make dinner together. We help Tommy with his Spanish homework. We paint watercolors and tell stories and figure out what it means to be a family who chooses joy over perfection." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow, I start the paperwork to change Tommy's homeschool curriculum to include art therapy and music therapy. Tomorrow, I call my lawyer about establishing a foundation for families with disabled children, one that focuses on adaptation and acceptance instead of just medical intervention." Jake paused, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "And tomorrow, I ask the most amazing woman I know if she'd be interested in moving from the staff wing to the master suite, because I'm tired of pretending she's anything less than the heart of this family." Joyce's gasp was audible. "Jake, are you—" "I'm asking if you'll marry me," Jake said simply. "I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life learning to dance with you. I'm asking if you'll help me raise a son who already knows that worth isn't measured in mobility, but in the size of one's heart." "What about your world?" Joyce asked, though her eyes were shining. "Your friends, your business associates, what will they think of you marrying the maid?" "They'll think I'm the luckiest man alive. And if they don't, then they're not people I need in my life anyway." Tommy had been listening to this exchange with barely contained excitement. Now he couldn't hold back any longer. "Say yes, Maria! Please say yes! We need you! Dad's terrible at making empanadas, and someone has to teach me the rest of that song about the flying boy." Joyce laughed through her tears, looking between the father and son who had become her whole world. "Yes," she whispered. "Sí, mi amor. Yes to all of it." Jake swept her into his arms, spinning her around while Tommy cheered and clapped.
When Jake set her down, she was breathless and radiant, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that transforms everything it touches. "I love you," Jake said, cupping her face in his hands. "I love your wisdom, your strength, your ability to see magic in ordinary moments. I love the way you make Tommy laugh and the way you've taught me to hope. I love you exactly as you are, and I can't wait to spend forever learning all the ways you're going to amaze me. Te amo también. I love you too, both of you, with all my heart." Their first kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they broke apart, Tommy was pretending to be disgusted, but couldn't hide his smile. "This is the best day ever," he announced, "even better than when I learned to paint clouds." As evening fell, they went inside together, not as employer and employee, not as patient and caregiver, but as a family who had learned that healing comes in many forms. They cooked dinner together, laughing as Jake burned the rice, and Joyce patiently showed him how to season the beans. Tommy set the table from his wheelchair, proud to contribute to their shared life. After dinner, they sat on the terrace under stars that seemed to shine more brightly than before. Tommy practiced his Spanish, while Jake and Joyce planned their future, a foundation to help families like theirs, a wedding in the garden where they'd learn to dance, a life built on acceptance and joy rather than the desperate pursuit of impossible perfection. "You know what the best part is?" Tommy said as Joyce tucked him into bed later that night. "What's that, mi nieto?" "Dad's not scared anymore. He used to look at me like he was afraid I might break, but now he looks at me like he's proud of who I am right now, not who I might become someday." Joyce's heart swelled with love for this wise little boy who had somehow maintained his grace through months of pain and uncertainty. "And how does that feel?"
"Like flying," Tommy said sleepily. "Like my grandmother's dancing. Like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." As Joyce kissed his forehead and whispered a Spanish blessing over his dreams, she knew that miracles did exist, not in the form of medical breakthroughs or surgical procedures, but in the quiet magic of hearts learning to see clearly. Downstairs, Jake waited for her on the terrace, 2 cups of coffee growing cold as he stared up at the stars. When she joined him, he pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of a world that had suddenly become full of possibility. "No regrets?" Joyce asked softly. "Only one," Jake said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to realize that the miracle I was searching for was already right here, living in my house, teaching my son to paint, showing me how to love without conditions." Joyce smiled, her head resting on his shoulder. "Maybe that's how all the best miracles work. They disguise themselves as ordinary people doing extraordinary things with love." "Is that what your grandmother would have said?" "That's exactly what she would have said. She always believed that angels come disguised as neighbors, strangers, and sometimes as maids, who end up becoming family." Jake tightened his arms around her, overwhelmed with gratitude for the storm that had brought her into their lives, for the accident that had taught them both what truly mattered, for the journey that had led them to this moment of perfect, imperfect, beautiful love. In his bedroom above them, Tommy slept peacefully, his dreams full of colors and music, and the certain knowledge that he was loved exactly as he was. His legs might never work again, but his spirit soared higher than any surgery could ever help him reach. And in the garden where they'd learned to dance, the roses bloomed in the darkness, their fragrance carrying on the night breeze like a blessing, like a promise, like the sweet music of souls who had finally found their rhythm and decided to dance together forever. The millionaire had spent millions trying to cure his son's legs, but it was the maid who had taught them both to fly. And there it is, love,
conquers all. What a beautiful journey from desperation to acceptance, from trying to fix people to learning to celebrate them exactly as they are. This story reminds us that the greatest healing often comes not from medicine, but from being truly seen and unconditionally loved. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what moment moved you most? Let's celebrate love in all its perfect imperfections together. Remember, you are already whole, already worthy, already enough, exactly as you are right now. Sometimes the greatest miracle is simply learning to see it. When love learns to see clearly, every heart discovers it was always perfect. It just needed the right dance partner to help it remember how to move.